Welcome back to Capital Gains. You know we love to dig into the sometimes messy, sometimes very messy, relationship between business and finance and politics. And today we're going to do a deep dive into Trump's cabinet, the group of individuals really shaping the financial landscape under Trump's new administration.
Right.
You might know their names, but we're going way beyond the headlines. We're going to really understand what makes these folks tick. What do they stand for? How could their past experience translate into actual real-world financial impacts?
Yeah, it's really an interesting mix. We're talking about people from traditional industries,
Yeah.
but then some that you might not expect to see influencing policy.
Exactly, and that's what makes it so interesting. We're talking to a tech mogul who's going to be managing federal lands, a former pastor heading up Veterans Affairs. We're even talking about an environmental activist who is going to be overseeing public health. So let's start with Doug Burgum. He's been tapped as Secretary of the Interior. You've probably heard this story before about how he mortgaged his family farm to invest in a tiny little software company called Great Plains, which he eventually sold to Microsoft for a cool $1.1 billion. But what does that tell us about how he might approach managing America's vast federal lands?
Well, that billion-dollar deal wasn't just luck. It suggests that this is someone with a keen eye for recognizing potential and a willingness to take risks. Calculated risks, of course, and he clearly understands how to scale a business. So when you think about managing federal lands, those skills could be really valuable. They could translate to some really innovative approaches to resource management, public-private partnerships, and even maybe leveraging technology to improve efficiency and sustainability.
So maybe we're going to see a more entrepreneurial approach to land management. I mean, it's definitely a departure from the traditional way of doing things.
Absolutely it is. And it raises a question. Will Burgum's background in tech and in business lead to policies that prioritize economic development over conservation? Or can he find a balance that actually benefits both?
All right, because these are big questions. Decisions about land use, they have ripple effects on industries like energy, agriculture, tourism.
Huge industries.
Yeah, huge stakes.
Right.
So this is definitely a cabinet pick to watch closely. All right, let's move on to Doug Collins, former pastor and Air Force Reserve chaplain. He's been tapped as Secretary of Veterans Affairs. His background seems like a natural fit for this role, given his focus on service and compassion.
Yeah, and I think it's more than just a feel-good fit. Collins has actually been a vocal advocate for veterans' benefits and healthcare reform during his time in Congress.
He's been in Congress before.
He has, so he really understands the challenges facing veterans, and he has a track record of pushing for policies to try to address those needs.
And this is a department with a massive budget, over $300 billion. So his decisions will have a significant impact on how those funds are allocated and how veterans receive care. It's not just about good intentions, it's about navigating a really complex bureaucracy and making some really, really tough choices.
Absolutely. And for investors, what this means is they're going to want to pay attention to companies that provide services or products to the VA, because policy shifts under Collins could create both opportunities and challenges in that sector.
Let's shift gears a bit and talk about a pick that has sparked a lot of debate. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. as Secretary of Health and Human Services. He's known for his work as an environmental lawyer, activist, championing clean water, fighting against corporate polluters. But his public opposition to certain vaccine mandates has raised some concerns. So how might those views influence his approach to public health policy?
This is where things get really, really interesting. RFK Jr. is a strong advocate for public health, but his stance on vaccines has alienated some in the medical community. So there is a potential there for some conflict. It's really crucial to understand that the Secretary of Health and Human Services oversees a wide range of agencies.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
We're talking the FDA, the CDC, the National Institutes of Health. So decisions made in this department impact everything from drug approvals, pandemic preparedness, healthcare access.
So his views on vaccines could have implications far beyond just that one issue.
Exactly. Investors in pharmaceuticals and the healthcare sectors in general are going to be watching closely to see how his leadership might affect regulations, research funding, the overall direction of public health policy. His appointment could signal a real shift in priorities, and understanding those shifts will be key to navigating the financial landscape.
Moving on, we have Kristi Noem, rancher-turned-governor, tapped as Secretary of Homeland Security.
Okay.
Now, her background in agriculture might not seem immediately relevant to this role. But remember, decisions made at Homeland Security, they have far-reaching impacts on trade, immigration,
Right.
and the overall economy.
Absolutely. Noam comes from a state, South Dakota, that's heavily reliant on agriculture. She has been a vocal advocate for policies that support farmers and ranchers. So the question is, how might that experience translate into her approach to border security, immigration, trade, all of which directly affect the agricultural workforce and the flow of goods?
It really raises questions about her priorities and how she'll balance the needs of different industries and stakeholders. Plus, her recent entanglement in that controversy surrounding her daughter's application for a real estate appraiser license has put her under some scrutiny.
Oh, right.
Those questions about transparency and potential conflicts of interest, they could impact her effectiveness in this role, especially when it comes to making decisions that could have financial implications.
Yeah, absolutely.
Speaking of potential conflicts of interest,
Yeah.
let's talk about Lee Zeldin, Trump's pick to lead the Environmental Protection Agency, former congressman with a military background. But his environmental record has raised some eyebrows. So how might he balance economic interests with environmental protection, especially given the complex relationship between regulations and business growth?
Yeah, that's a really, really tough balancing act. And it's one that's going to have some really significant consequences. For industries ranging from energy to manufacturing to agriculture, investors are going to be watching closely to see whether he favors deregulation and economic growth, or takes a more cautious approach. That prioritizes environmental protection. His decisions could impact everything from emission standards to permitting processes, with ripple effects throughout the economy.
It's all about understanding the potential pressure points and anticipating how policy shifts might create opportunities or challenges for different sectors. And that's what makes his cabinet so fascinating to analyze. It's a blend of individuals with these diverse backgrounds and potentially conflicting priorities. And their decisions will have real-world consequences for all of us. All right, before we move on to the next group of cabinet picks, I want to pause for a moment and ask you a question. What stands out to you so far? What has surprised you? Or what are you most curious to see unfold? Hold that thought. Because we're going to be diving into even more intriguing figures and their potential impact on the financial landscape in just a moment.
Welcome back to Capital Gains. As we delve a little deeper into Trump's cabinet, it's becoming pretty clear that he has really chosen some folks with unconventional backgrounds. And it raises some interesting questions about their priorities, how they might wield their influence.
Some of these picks seem like they're straight out of left field. Let's take Linda McMahon. She's the former CEO of World Wrestling Entertainment.
Yes.
That's right, professional wrestling.
Ah.
And now she's been tapped as Secretary of Veterans Affairs.
Wow.
Quite a jump.
It might seem like an odd fit on the surface.
Yeah.
But if you really think about the skills it takes to run a successful entertainment empire, there are some really interesting parallels. McMahon has experience managing a large organization, negotiating complex deals, marketing to a really diverse audience, and maybe most importantly, controlling costs. The VA, with its sprawling bureaucracy and massive budget, could actually benefit from someone with that kind of business acumen.
But do those skills translate directly to overseeing the well-being of veterans? We're talking about healthcare.
It benefits.
Addressing the unique needs of those who have served our country. It's not exactly the same as putting on a wrestling show.
Right, you're right. That's a valid concern. And it's one that veterans groups and lawmakers are going to be scrutinizing very closely. Her success in the world of entertainment doesn't necessarily guarantee that she's going to be able to navigate the very complex and sensitive issues facing the VA. Her lack of experience in government and healthcare could be a significant hurdle.
And for investors,
Yeah.
this appointment raises some really interesting questions. Will she bring a more business-oriented approach to the VA, potentially leading to changes in how services are delivered or how contracts are awarded? Could we see a push for privatization or increased efficiency measures? These are all factors that could really impact companies operating in the healthcare and government services sectors.
Absolutely. Now let's shift gears a bit and talk about the Department of Transportation, where Scott Turner, a former Texas state representative, has been nominated. He's a pretty conservative Republican, known for his advocacy for limited government and fiscal responsibility. How might those principles translate into transportation policy, especially given the aging infrastructure and the funding challenges facing our nation's roads, bridges, and transit systems?
That's a really critical question, especially for those of you out there who are interested in infrastructure spending and the companies that stand to benefit from those investments. His background suggests he might favor privatization, reduce regulations, a focus on cost-cutting measures. But will that approach be enough to address the massive backlog of infrastructure needs? Or could it lead to further deterioration and even greater costs down the road?
And how will he balance the needs of urban and rural communities, each with their own kind of unique transportation challenges? Will we see a shift in funding priorities, maybe with less emphasis on public transportation and more on highways and private sector initiatives? These are all questions that investors and policymakers are going to be grappling with as he takes the helm of the Department of Transportation.
It's next on our list. Sean Duffy, former U.S. representative from Wisconsin, who has been tapped as Secretary of Energy, given his background as a vocal supporter of the fossil fuel industry and a critic of environmental regulations. This appointment has sent some ripples through the energy sector.
It's a really clear signal that Trump is prioritizing energy independence and deregulation. Duffy's selection aligns with the administration's focus on boosting domestic energy production, particularly in oil and gas. This could translate into policies that favor traditional energy sources over clean energy alternatives, potentially impacting investment flows and the trajectory of renewable energy development.
So while this might be good news for companies involved in oil and gas exploration and production, it could create some headwinds for those in the renewable energy space. It's a classic example of how political decisions can create winners and losers in the market.
Yeah, absolutely. Now let's move on to an appointment that has raised more than a few eyebrows. Chris Wright, the CEO of Liberty Energy, a major player in the oil and gas industry, has been nominated for Secretary of Education. This is a real departure from the traditional profile of an education secretary. And it's left many wondering how his background will shape his approach to education policy.
It's definitely an unconventional choice. While his business acumen and experience managing a large organization could be really valuable assets, his lack of direct experience in education has sparked some concerns. Will he prioritize school choice, vocational training, or perhaps even energy industry-related education initiatives?
And how will he address issues like teacher shortages, funding disparities, the digital divide, all of which have a significant impact on educational outcomes and the future workforce? His appointment could signal a shift in priorities, potentially favoring market-based solutions and private sector involvement in education.
It's a development that warrants close attention, not only for those involved in the education sector, but also for anyone interested in the long-term economic implications of education policy. Our final stop on this part of the deep dive takes us back to the Department of Homeland Security. Remember Doug Collins, former pastor and veterans advocate we discussed earlier?
Yes.
It seems there's been a bit of a shuffle within Trock's cabinet. Linda McMahon is now slated for the VA, and Collins has been moved to Homeland Security.
Interesting.
So how does his background as a chaplain and former congressman align with the complex and often controversial world of Homeland Security?
It's a bit of a puzzle. His experience as a chaplain suggests a focus on compassion and moral values, which could inform his approach to issues like immigration and then refugee resettlement. However, his time in Congress likely exposed him to national security concerns and the need for strong border security measures. So how will he balance these potentially competing priorities?
And how will his background shape his approach to cybersecurity, counterterrorism efforts, disaster preparedness, all of which fall under the umbrella of Homeland Security? His appointment raises a lot of questions about the direction of this crucial department.
It's a reminder that the intersection of business, finance, and politics is rarely straightforward. The individuals Trump has chosen for his cabinet bring a real mix of experiences, ideologies, potential conflicts of interest. Understanding their backgrounds and motivations is essential for navigating this complex financial landscape.
Before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I want to leave you with this thought. We've explored the potential impacts of these cabinet picks on various sectors. But how might their decisions affect everyday life? From the cost of healthcare, to the quality of education, to the security of our nation. These are the questions we'll continue to explore as we delve deeper into Trump's cabinet and the far-reaching consequences of their actions. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground in our deep dive into Trump's cabinet, and it's really clear that these appointments have the potential to really shake things up across a bunch of different sectors. But what does it all actually mean, for you, the listener, who's just trying to make sense of this financial landscape and, make informed decisions?
Well, I think it means that we're probably going to see some pretty bold moves, some unexpected policy shifts, and maybe even some volatility in the markets. As investors try to, kind of adjust to this new reality, remember, uncertainty can breed both risk and opportunity.
So how can we make sense of all this information and use it to our advantage?
Well, the key is to kind of look beyond the headlines and try to understand the underlying motivations and priorities of these folks. We've talked about their backgrounds, their stated policy goals, their potential conflicts of interest. Now it's really about connecting the dots and anticipating how their decisions might translate into concrete actions.
Let's do a quick recap of the key players and the sectors they're likely to impact. We've got Doug Burgum, the tech mogul, overseeing federal lands, potentially shaking up resource management. Doug Collins, the former pastor and veterans advocate, now in charge of Homeland Security, facing those complex challenges. Related to immigration, border security, cybersecurity.
And don't forget Linda McMahon, the former WWE CEO. Taking on the massive task of leading the VA, her business acumen could really bring some significant changes, but, lack of experience in government and healthcare raises some concerns.
Definitely. Then there's Robert F. Kennedy Jr., the environmental activist, heading up Health and Human Services, where his stance on vaccines and his focus on public health could have far-reaching implications for the healthcare sector.
Absolutely. And we can't overlook Sean Duffy, the fossil fuel advocate, leading the Department of Energy, signaling a potential shift toward traditional energy sources.
Yeah.
And deregulation.
Right. And finally, Chris Wright, the oil and gas executive, now in charge of education, raising some questions about his priorities and how his background will shape education policy.
I mean, it's a diverse group, to say the least, and their decisions are going to have ripple effects throughout the economy and, society as a whole.
So what's the takeaway for our listeners?
Stay informed, stay engaged. Don't be afraid to ask tough questions. The intersection of business, finance, and politics is constantly evolving, and really understanding the forces at play is essential for navigating this financial landscape and making good decisions.
I love that. As we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with one final thought. We focused on the potential impacts of Trump's cabinet on the financial world. But their decisions will also shape the social fabric of our nation. How will their policies affect healthcare access, educational opportunities, environmental protection, and the overall well-being of our communities? These are questions worth pondering as we kind of move forward in this new era.
Absolutely. And remember, knowledge is power. The more you understand about the forces shaping the world around you, the better equipped you'll be to navigate the challenges and seize the opportunities that lie ahead.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into Trump's cabinet. We encourage you to continue your own exploration and stay tuned for more insights from Capital Gains.